Hi students, this week we will be using Rebecca Solnit's A Field Guide to Getting Lost to think about the paradox in Plato's Meno. So in the first chapter of A Field Guide to Getting Lost, Rebecca Solnit talked about this passage from Plato's Meno that haunted her. And it's a question that says, how will you go about finding that thing, the nature of which is totally unknown to you? So for Solnit, a lot of life is about navigating unfamiliar spaces and figuring out what to do when we don't really have a guide. So what to do when we're lost. And she thinks Plato's Meno really touches upon this. So that's what we're going to be doing this week, is thinking about what this dialogue that's 2,500 years old, means for us today. I'm also going to be using Rebecca Solnit to kind of connect a bunch of ideas that we've talked about each week. So the first thing I want you to think about is how Bell Hooks described critical thinking. So critical thinking requires us to really do a lot of the work ourselves. We can't just let other people give us information and memorize it. We have to ask questions. We have to ask the who, what, when, where, how. We have to be really engaged and interested in finding answers. We have to have an open mind with an imagination and let ourselves see things from many perspectives, which requires changing our mind, right? So we have to have a flexible mind that's really looking for answers. And we have to kind of have a sense of passion, right? We have to care. We have to sort of come from a space of wanting to find a new understanding of something. And it is also something that involves community. It's something we do with others, because when we talk about ideas with other people, they challenge us and they help us to see things differently. We also see this in the allegory of the cave, right? Plato emphasizes that someone has to move through the cave by looking at things for themselves. So you can't just waltz into the cave and tell people who are looking at shadows, hey, that's not real. If you want to see what's real, we got to walk outside. There's a sun outside, and that's the real source of truth. That's going to make no sense to the people in the cave. Instead, they have to go through this process where they see things for themselves and they learn. And so Plato says that, education isn't what some people think it is, putting knowledge into an empty brain or having an empty head and having people put knowledge in that. Instead, he says the power to learn is present in everyone's soul, and they simply need to be oriented in the right direction and in the right space to learn. So he says education takes for granted that sight is there, but that it isn't turned the right way or looking where it ought to look, and it tries to redirect it appropriately. So the cave kind of gives us this idea that in order to learn, there's a certain type of navigation you need to have. You need to be able to navigate your way through the unknown. You need to be able to work your way out of these sort of chains of ignorance, and you need to be able to question what seems certain to you or familiar, these sort of shadows on the cave wall, and move into spaces that are unfamiliar in order to discover what's true. So we talked about this in relation to the divided line. The divided line is this sort of step ladder, or this sort of step-by-step method you use to get to an understanding of something, or for Plato, where you grasp the form. And it means that you have to let go of how things appear to you, your sort of basic opinions about things that may not be very secure and are just based on the way things look to you. So you have to be willing to let go of familiar appearances and assumptions about things and question them in order to get at an understanding of something. And we see Socrates challenging people to do this in what is called the Socratic method, which we learned about when you read the Apology, right? So Socrates is appearing before the court, and he's describing how he practices philosophy through this process of question and answering, which is the Socratic method, or elenchus, or sometimes called dialectics. But it's going back and forth through questions and answers. So you ask them a question like, what is justice? They provide an answer of what they think justice is. You ask them more questions and you go back and forth. And usually what this does is reveals sort of weak assumptions people have, unfounded opinions about things, sometimes contradictions or blind spots. And so it demonstrates what people do not know. It does a better job of revealing what people don't know than of showing people what they actually know. So, what happens is in a Socratic dialogue where people are going back and forth, you frequently have someone say, Socrates, I do not know. And that's because his questions have pushed them to a point where they can't go any further. They realize they were wrong. They realize that they thought they knew something. They had a very firm belief. And when it was questioned and they had to explain themselves, they realized they don't actually have a good reason for thinking that way. That's just always the way they've thought about it. So, aporia, or no passage, right, impasse, is a moment when we realize the thing we firmly thought we knew, we actually don't know. And it kind of pulls the rug from underneath us. It makes us feel very disoriented. And in these dialogues, some people get very angry at Socrates and refuse to talk with him further because they feel foolish, right? Because their ignorance has been shown. But other people are willing to move beyond that and continue the conversation with Socrates. So, what you do with aporia really depends on your attitude and whether you are willing to learn more. So, aporia is not necessarily bad, especially if you're Socrates, because Socrates thinks that the wisest thing you can know is that you do not know. That's what Socratic wisdom is knowing that you do not know. So in the Apology, we also read that the Delphi Oracle said Socrates was the wisest individual. And he said that didn't make very much sense to him because he didn't know anything. And so he went around asking all sorts of experts questions to try to prove that someone was wiser than he was. And he actually found that a lot of people claim to know things they don't actually know. They're not aware that they don't know because they're so confident in their beliefs. So Socratic method actually revealed that the hardest thing to know is when you do not know. Very few people are willing to understand and see their own ignorance. It often has to be pointed out to us by someone else, and then we usually don't respond too well to it. So Socrates is wise because he does not know, and it's the conversations that kind of show us that we do not know. Socratic method shows us that we need to be wiser like Socrates and admit we do not know. And then in the Phaedo, which you read for last week, we also have this idea of why we don't really know things that well. It's because we rely on our bodies and our senses. So our bodies distract us, they give us wrong information all the time, they make us confused and dizzy. When we're examining things with our sight or our eyes, we frequently can get them wrong because things frequently do look different, right? We know not to judge a book by a cover, not to look at a person and assume we know things based upon their appearance. And also, if we're thinking about the way our senses work, it's not our senses alone that tell us something, right? So if I'm thinking about what makes a tree, right, which Socrates would say is the form of a tree, the essence of a tree is the form of it. If I'm just looking at what I know with my senses, it will always look different. If it's really, a small tree because it's just growing from its seed, it's only a week old, it's going to be small. And if it's a very old tree, like the sequoias, it could be hundreds of feet tall, right? It could be very, very tall. And so it could also be an evergreen tree or a palm tree or an oak tree. And those all look so different from each other. So unless I understand the concept of what makes a tree, which is not something I know through my senses, it's an idea, then I'm not really going to have a firm understanding. I'm just going to have all these different notions of what a tree are and not really understand what is unifying them or bringing them together. And so our minds and ideas clarify things using thought and reason. And thought and reason move us away from the senses and appearances and our bodies. And when we're in our bodies, we're frequently lost and confused for Socrates. And that's why Socrates thinks either we know the truth when we're dead, when our souls are separated from our body, or we never really know the truth. And he has this other idea is that the reason we can figure things out, even though our senses are so confused, is because we're remembering things we used to know. We've reincarnated many times. And the sensible world is kind of like the shadows on the cave wall. So it's not like they're completely false, right? They're the shadows that real objects cast. They're just not the right perspective of those real things. And so when we're looking around using our senses, we can be reminded of these ideas we knew when we were just a soul without a body. So our senses remind us of what we knew in the afterlife. And Plato's Meno discusses this idea that learning is recollection a little bit more. So in the Meno, the pages I had you read, I only had you read 7 pages or so. It's this question that kind of motivates the Meno, right? Which Solnit talks about. How will you aim to search for something you do not know at all, right? How do you look for the unfamiliar? And Meno raises this question because he's trying to show Socrates is wrong. He's trying to win a debate. And he says, this is how Meno poses it. He says, someone cannot search. Here, a man means any person, not just a gender. It's not supposed to be gendered, right? So a person cannot search either for what he knows or for what he does not know. He cannot search for what he knows since he knows it. There's no need to search, nor for what he does not know, for he does not know what to look for. So this may sound puzzling, but essentially it's setting up this very black and white argument, which is if we know something, we know it, and we don't have to go look for that information. We don't have to go figure it out. And if we don't know it, if we're completely ignorant of it, why would we be looking for it? And if we looked for it, how would we ever know we discovered it? And so essentially what this is arguing is that gaining knowledge or learning anything is impossible. Either you know something or you don't. And this can be a tempting way to think, right? Sometimes it can feel this way, as if you completely grasp something or you don't have it at all. And Socrates, he doesn't think this is true. When we're learning, we're working from what we already know, and we're working towards a greater understanding of something. That's what the divided line shows us, is we have to kind of climb step by step. We don't start from nowhere. We do start with senses and appearances. They're just not the whole picture, and they're not a very accurate picture. But we do begin from somewhere. And for Socrates, he thinks that the reason we can reach that truth, even though it feels like we're looking for something we've never seen or don't really understand, he says that it is because we're actually recollecting something we used to know. We're finding knowledge within ourselves. Now, this is a really interesting idea, the idea that all learning is finding something within yourself, because it has to do with the fact that we are active participants in learning. We're not just receiving information from the outside. We're not just this vessel that's empty that people put ideas in. Right? That would make learning a passive process where you're just a collection of little pebbles of information. Instead, we're working through it. We're figuring it out with all these tools and resources that we have within ourselves. And Socrates thinks this is because the soul has been reborn many times and has seen all sorts of things and has learned everything. And so it remembers it in the sensible world. The sensible world kind of has these shadows of what the other world is like, and it jogs our memory. And for Socrates, he demonstrates this by taking someone who has no knowledge of geometry, a servant, and helping them solve a geometry problem. But in this geometry problem, all Socrates is doing is asking the servant questions, and the servant has to think through it and figure it out and arrive at an answer. And the servant is able to do this even though they have no education in geometry. And that's, for Socrates, an indication that the answers were already there. They just needed to be prompted by the right question. So questions make us perplexed. They give us a certain desire for the answer. They make us realize we don't know something. If someone asks you a question and you don't know something, that helps you get the curiosity and the desire to learn. And so for Socrates, this is why questioning is such an important part of philosophy. This is why philosophy begins in wonder, right? If you think about what wonder is, wondering has to do with curiosity, with being in awe of something, realizing you don't know something and you want to know it. And that is where philosophy begins. So this is what Rebecca Solnit is thinking about. She's thinking about that philosophical attitude of wonder, that ability to say, I don't know. What do we do with that? How do we use that to navigate our lives? And so she's thinking of how we can kind of apply some of these ideas in our own lives. So back to this question, how will you go about finding that thing, the nature of which is totally unknown to you? For Solnit, this has to do with life, because life is full of uncertainty. Life is full of moments where you're in a new space where you don't really know what you're supposed to do or where you are, or where you've become a new person, you've transformed. And so you aren't quite sure what to do because something fundamental about you has shifted or changed. So she gives us two different senses of the word lost. When she's talking about the sort of power of loss, there's the first case where we might lose something that's familiar to us. So like a pen I always use or my keys, if I lose that, then a familiar object falls away. Or I myself can get lost. That means I've moved to a completely new space where there's no familiar objects. And in that case, the unfamiliar appears to me. And she says in that moment, the world has become larger than my knowledge of it. So if we think about the world becoming larger than my knowledge of it, that's something you experience as you mature in life. If you move to a new spot, if you start college and you have to make new friends and learn how to sort of be more in charge of your own education, right? In high school, there's a lot of people overseeing how you learn, and in college, you have to kind of rise to the task and form your own study habits. So there's many different moments in our lives where we suddenly find the world has become larger than our knowledge of it. And for Solnit, she says there's an art of navigating those moments. There's an art of being at home in the unknown, where we don't feel panic and we're not suffering because we're in the unknown, right? So we can develop certain skills for being at home with being lost. The idea of being lost means we're fundamentally not at home. We're not in a familiar space, but we can be comfortable and we can learn how to be more familiar with being in unfamiliar spaces, being attentive, problem solving. What sort of curiosity, what sort of sense of wonder do we need to navigate the unknown in life? And for Solnit, this is very fundamental because she says if you never get lost, you're not going to really live. And if you get lost but you don't know what to do, she says that will bring you to destruction. But in between those two extremes, either always staying at home and never really exploring the unknown, or kind of dying in the wilderness because you don't know what to do and you got too lost, in between those two extremes, there's this whole terra incognita. That means land of unknown, an unknown space, an uncharted space. And that is a life of discovery. And that's what Solnit is challenging us to embrace. How do we live a life of discovery? How do we put ourselves into unknown spaces and learn how to navigate those spaces? So she talks about different occupations where people are really good at getting lost or people encouraging us to get lost. The first one is artists. So she says it's the job of artists to open doors and invite in prophecies, the unfamiliar, the unknown. So someone like Basquiat, right, this great artist who really transformed the art scene. A lot of times when people are inventing something new, right, they're playing with the unknown. They're trying to find a new way to articulate an idea. It might be a familiar idea, but they're trying to make it unfamiliar. They're trying to find a new expression for it. And so a lot of inspiration has to come from the space of the unknown. And when you're observing a work of art, if you totally understand what it means and like just like that, you totally grasp it, there's no questions that arise, there's no sense of awe or no process of wondering, that's usually not a great work of art. That might be kind of kitschy or campy or pretty simplistic. So a lot of what art is doing for you is inviting you to kind of open up your mind and experience something, see something from a different perspective. So art invites us into the unknown and the unfamiliar. A lot of times art is making the familiar unfamiliar. And then scientists also deal with the unfamiliar. So Solnit quotes the scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer, who said that scientists live always at the edge of mystery, the boundary of the unknown. So there's a lot of ways we talk about science where we're like the new frontiers of science, right? A frontier is a land of discovery where you're trying to push your familiar space forward and trying to sort of conquer the unfamiliar in a way. And so scientists are trying to always figure out, you know, new hypotheses and what don't we know? What can we know? What can we learn? So Jane Goodall is a good example of this. She completely transformed the way we sort of observe animals and understand animals. We used to take them and put them in cages or in labs and do certain types of experiments that are meant to understand their behavior. And instead, she kind of treated it more like an anthropological task where you go out into nature and you observe them. And people thought that was a wild idea. No one understood what she was doing. People did not take it seriously. But she ended up transforming the entire scientific practice around observing animal behavior because of what she did. And she was willing to go into the unknown. She was willing to go into this uncharted territory to do so. So we have other sort of philosophers like Henry David Thoreau talking about why it's so important to get lost. And he says that it invites us to think about the vastness and strangeness of nature. It's not until we are lost that we have lost the world do we begin to find ourselves and realize where we are and the infinite extent of our relations. So for Thoreau, he's very famous for going out into the woods. He said he wanted to rediscover life and suck the marrow out of life and live more deeply and breathe life, right? He was really trying to rediscover life. And in one sense, that means rediscovering the world, how big and vast and mysterious the world is. But in the other sense, it was also about rediscovering himself and figuring out who he was and what did it mean to be human. So it's doing both. When we get lost, we are getting a new sense of the world because we're in an unfamiliar space and we're learning about it, but we're also learning about ourselves. We are becoming unfamiliar to ourselves. We are becoming new people. So the Wintu tribe is really interesting for thinking about this whole navigating space and how the self relates to the surroundings and our environment, and why getting lost involves both a loss of self and a loss of one's world and re-navigating that loss. And so the Wintu language does not have a word for right or left. When we talk about right or left, those are directions that have to do with my own body, right? My right hand, my left hand. For the Wintu, you have your hands would be called north, south, west, or east, right? That's determined by the directions, the cardinal directions of the world. So the world determines your hand. So if I get a mosquito bite on my right hand, it doesn't matter where in the world I'm pointing, it's always my right hand. But for a Wintu, if I get a mosquito bite on my hand while I'm going up a mountain and it's my hand's facing north, my north hand has a mosquito bite on it. And then when I'm going down south, going the opposite direction down the mountain, if my hand is now pointing south, then my south hand has a mosquito bite on it. So I'm relabeling what my hand is in relationship to my environment rather than making my body the primary place where my body's own position, the primary place where I determine what it's called. And for Solnit, she says that this really describes a different relationship between the self and environment. In this sense, the self only exists in reference to the rest of the world. There's no you without the mountains, without the sun, without the sky. In Wintu, it's the world that's stable. The directions of the world stay the same, and you yourself are contingent. You change. There's nothing about you that remains the same because it's always determined by its surroundings. And this is why there's this sort of intimate relationship between a Wintu person and their environment, particularly when they're at home and they're in a very familiar space. And then if they decide to wander and get lost, the sense of self becomes undone because the self is defined in relationship to the environment. And so for the Wintu, if you decide to go wander into all these familiar spaces, that could lead to madness, but it could also lead to divine wisdom because it's going to transform and change who you are. And you could become a shaman or a wise person. So for the Wintu, they give us a sense of what it means to navigate an unfamiliar space as being something that undoes you and transforms you in a really radical way. So this is why for Solnit, she thinks this question at the heart of Meno is the basic tactical question in life. In your life, you're going to change, you're going to move, you're going to be in different spaces, you're going to be in different learning spaces, you're going to meet new people, your sense of yourself is going to change. And in all those different ways, you're going to have to learn how to re-navigate new spaces and new situations. And she says the things we want are transformative, and we don't know or only think we know what is on the other side of that transformation. Love, wisdom, grace, inspiration. These are all things that involve transforming us. And we don't know who we're going to be at the other end of that. If I fall in love with someone, they will change me. And at the end of that relationship, I'm not sure who I'm going to become or who I will have become. Same thing with inspiration. if I learn something new, if I discover a new talent, if I decide to, cultivate a new hobby or creative activity, that's going to transform who I am. And I don't know who I will become. So, how do you go about finding these things that are in some ways about extending the boundaries of the self into unknown territory, about becoming someone else? That is the major question she's posing to us. And she's tying it to this idea of the Meno, which is whenever you're discovering or learning something, it is a deeply transformative relation to oneself. You are rediscovering yourself. You're discovering a new self, a self you used to be, and you're becoming someone else. So for Solnit, that's what it means to live, and that's what it means to learn. And she's basing these reflections on Plato's Meno. Okay, so if you have any questions this week, feel free to send me an email or set up a time to talk online. I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts on A Field Guide to Getting Lost and Plato's Meno.